Hello, everybody. Sorry to keep you waiting. We had some technical difficulties, but we're ready to go now. My name is Adrian van Alphen. I'm a board member of the Netherlands-America Foundation New England Chapter. We just changed our name from Boston Chapter to New England Chapter to include all of the New England states. The webinar is going to be recorded and is going to be published next week. It's a series of occasional talks and lectures that we hold. Today's webinar will be presented by Mr. Jeffrey Price. The NAF has been focused on funding educational exchange for American students and scholars, sponsorship, and fostering business ties between the United States and the Netherlands. I met Jeffrey at the MIT Museum, where he actually gave an Escher seminar. We talked afterwards, and then we said, well, it would be great if we could repeat this seminar, but then for a larger audience. So Jeffrey ran a gallery specialized in Escher art. He is also a researcher and has an enthusiastic audience. He continues to be a researcher, collector, and dealer in Escher prints. And one household topic, there is an opportunity for questions and answers after the lecture. So I give you Mr. Jeffrey Price.
Hartelijk dank dat ik in het Engels mag spreken in plaats van in het Nederlands. I'm very grateful that I can speak to you in English today, since my Dutch is barely good enough to order a stroopwafel in Amsterdam. That said, let's take a look at what M.C. Escher called his amazing images. The title of this presentation was invented by Escher himself. In the notebook drawing you see here, Escher worked out a crossword on graph paper with the phrase amazing images in English and in Dutch. He wanted this to be the title of the first book about his art, and this could have been the cover illustration, but the publisher rejected his title and went with graphic work, which makes me suspicious of publishers. But I thought the title was too good to waste, and so when I published my own book of pictures and essays about Escher last year, I titled it Amazing Images. Contact me if you'd like a copy. Now, what did Escher find amazing? Well, here's a woodblock print he created called Smaller and Smaller. It must have taken a tremendous amount of thought and infinite patience to make this woodblock print. I think it's amazing, and Escher would not have created it if he didn't feel the same way. You can dive into the center with a magnifying glass, and Escher actually made a separate print here of just the center section. It required two wood blocks of very dense end-grain wood, one for the black ink and one for the orange ink, to create the details you see here. And this may look just like the final print you just saw, but look at the lizards in the corner. Here's the final print again. The lizards get really, really tiny in the center, and every white, orange, and black one has to follow a precise set of rules in order to create the illusion of infinity. Most amazing of all, this had to be carved into blocks of wood with chisels, and it took 4 separate wood blocks to create this finished print. How Escher did that is a wonderful puzzle to solve, and you can do that on your own. Now, how did a child born in 1898 to a wealthy, educated family become the artist M.C. Escher? Young Moritz Cornelis Escher, who his friends and family called Mauk, was not a good student and showed no ability whatsoever for mathematics or for homework in general. I can relate to that. With failing grades and incomplete tests, he was only able to continue in school through the intervention of his father, who was a respected engineer and a government official. The only class he liked was art, and here's a small statue of Escher showing us something he found fascinating as a child. He would take the cheese sandwich his mother had made him for lunch, carefully break the piece of cheese into creative shapes, which he could then rearrange back on his bread so that they neatly aligned with the crust. Fortunately, after years of academic frustration, he found a printmaking teacher who showed him how to make a linoleum print and a woodcut. And as soon as Escher discovered printmaking, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He would become a graphic artist and create woodblock prints. And right from the start, Escher made pictures of things with patterns. Here's a 1921 woodcut of a hand holding a pine cone. Look closely at the enlargement on the right. Every scale has a black part at the bottom, a V-shaped notch in the middle, and a white area next to a striped shape above. These shapes spiral up the cone. Mathematicians understand that this arrangement of the scales on a pine cone would follow what's known as the Fibonacci sequence, but for Escher, it was all about the patterns that made sense and not the formulas. The pine cone is perfect, and the very human hand looks round and strong and muscular. We see these things because Escher has carved away strips of wood to leave little black lines that taper and curve at the end. The more you look, the more amazing Escher's pictures become. Here's a woodcut created just a year after the pine cone in 1922, when he illustrated a book of philosophical essays by a friend with 15 prints that illustrated themes that fascinated Escher for the rest of his life. How he wrote a table of contents for his work before he had created it is one of the great mysteries in Escher. The title of this print is simply the word beautiful. And beautiful for Escher is this crystalline form that looks something like a faceted gemstone. It's complicated, but far from random. Escher shifts the symmetrical patterns around in mirror reflections which form a circle within a rectangle. It all makes perfect sense, but it would be an impossibly difficult shape to recreate from your memory. On the right, we see Escher's original woodblock that printed every example of this print. Look at how straight the lines are. You can see Escher's chisel marks where he carved away the wood. Someone, and it wasn't me, added gray chalk to the parts Escher carved away so we could see his technique more clearly. And I'd like you to see now just how Escher carved his woodblock prints. Here we see Escher in his studio in 1969, working on a study for his final print, Ring Snakes, which we'll be looking at later. Escher could spend months making studies for a print. After he was satisfied with his design, he would pick up chisels like you see here and begin carving his woodblock. Escher had to make sure to only carve away areas that will be blank on the final print. The remaining surface of the wood is what will become the image. His chisels must be very sharp and his hand incredibly steady so all the edges can be perfect. Any overcut will ruin the print and he'd have to start all over again. There are no do-overs in carving a woodblock. Once the block is carved, he mixes ink and rolls it out onto a piece of glass, going crossways to make sure the ink is even. When the ink is perfect, he then uses the roller to roll the ink onto his woodblock, being careful to not let the ink fill in any of the spaces between his lines. Then the inked woodblock is placed on his printing paper, and a board is placed on top so he can flip the block and the print over together. Now we can see the back of the paper, which Escher must press against the ink block. Here he's using a roller, and sometimes he used a bone teaspoon, which traditionally was used to eat a soft-boiled egg. The pressure transfers the ink from the block onto the paper, and it's very thin printmaking paper, so he could watch the ink being absorbed into the fibers, and finally the print can be lifted from the block and a single example of an Escher woodcut has been created. Now that you know how he did it, here is one of the most unusual prints Escher created in his early days. He was 25 years old, and he carved a woodblock that showed 8 heads that fit together, with half of them being upside down. But that was just the beginning. Here is Escher's final print. He has taken his woodblock and printed parts of it 8 times around the center image. This might make it a little easier for you to see what he's done. The 8 heads have multiplied, and in fact, Escher could add as many heads as he wanted to the design, like this. This could go on forever, and it could be shown upside down. In fact, Escher's woodblock is like a seed that can grow an infinite number of heads. The purpose of a woodblock is to make an image that can be printed again and again, and Escher's images do sometimes repeat within themselves. Escher equated being a printmaker to being a troubadour who could bring his song from town to town. Each print Escher made told the same story as when he first printed his block. When Escher finished carving, he'd make a few prints and store them in his studio, and if those sold out, and if he felt like it, he could take out his woodblock and print a few more copies. Occasionally he exhibited them in small galleries, but for the most of his life, his prints did not sell well, so he didn't make many copies, and these he sold for small sums. Fortunately, Escher was supported by his parents, and then he married very well. Secrets of an Artist's Survival. Shortly after making this print, Escher traveled to Italy, where he fell in love with the rolling hills and ancient towns. Escher loved exploring remote villages and the rugged landscapes that were so different from the flat polders of Holland. Here he shows us the area around Castrovalva, a town in central Italy, a little bit east of Rome. Imagine you're standing on the path in the lower left by the flowers. Walking forward, you could look up at the town overhead, but to get there, you'd have to take a long walk around the mountain. Now, if you start your walk again next to those flowers and step to your right, you'll find yourself tumbling down a bottomless cliff into a distant landscape. If you survive the fall, you can walk for miles on pathways through the villages and the fields, and you'll eventually come to mountains near the horizon. And there another village appears that seems to be made of sugar cubes, and beyond that is a long road leading to a valley, and beyond that is one last mountain that reaches up towards the crisp edges of dark clouds. Look up and follow those clouds back to Castrovalva, where we began this long visual voyage. And look how far we've come. The details, the perspective, and the extreme distance all fill our senses and imagination. Escher loved Italy, so he rented a house in Rome where he lived and worked for more than a dozen years. Look at Escher's woodcut of the coast of Amalfi on the left. It's one of the last woodcuts he made in Italy. If you were standing where Escher was when he saw this view, at your feet you'd see a dark stairway. Look at the detail at the bottom right, and you'll see that the steps are made from tiny chips in the wood. Go back to the print on the left, climb down the steps, and you could walk down a long beach with fishing boats and buildings until you come to a dark tower at Land's End. In the detail at the upper right, you can see the mighty tower is actually covered with polka dots, quite unexpected. Past the tower, beyond the sea, there's a mountain range, and that's made from thousands of scratches of Escher's knife. And when we step back, you see, we can see the world, but look closely and you'll see very different things. In our world, atoms, molecules, and crystals invisibly fill the world like Escher's scratches did. What we see, we believe to be reality itself. But it's all in our mind. Our eyes See Escher's black ink on white paper, and our imagination creates a seacoast town. Indeed, when you see an Escher print, the first reaction is to want to see more, to discover how Escher imagined and created all that you're seeing by stamping ink on paper. Yes, there is simply more to see in an Escher print than in other art, and I'll prove it to you. Imagine if we saw the world in black and white, with no shades of gray. I find that quite impossible, but Escher taught himself to see what he would print. Once Escher's son asked him why he had spent all day drawing an insect. In order to see it, I had to draw it, said Escher. Escher remembered what he'd seen by making drawings, taking photographs, and collecting postcards. Those were easy tasks compared to making a print. In printmaking, you can only do one thing: cut away wood so you create spaces that will show the paper and not the ink. Carving a woodblock gives you only lines and edges. The artist arranges these to make us believe that we're seeing a dragonfly. And here you see close-ups of the leaf and the wing. On the left, Escher has limited himself to only carving straight, horizontal, and vertical lines. They can be thick or thin. Their spacing varies in ways that make us believe we're seeing a leaf's soft contours. To limit your technique to only straight lines and black and white like this is like writing a poem only using the letters in the first half of the alphabet. To replicate a dragonfly's iridescent wings, Escher has cut hundreds of little shapes, some squares that grow larger and larger, some blocks that look like houses, while others contain combs or forks of sharp black lines. Escher visited the Alhambra Palace in Granada in 1922, and again in 1936. There he saw tiles like these, designed by Moorish craftsmen hundreds of years before. He was mesmerized by the patterns he saw and drew painstaking copies of the tiles design. Shapes like this, tessellations of repeating shapes, would intrigue Escher for the rest of his life. Islamic tiles were pure geometry because their religion forbade the representation of living things. Escher, however, discovered that by jiggling the edges of the shapes, all sorts of marvelous creatures could be created. But living in Rome became difficult in the mid-30s, and the government had ordered Escher's sons to become part of Mussolini's fascist youth brigade, like the one you see here. So in 1935, Escher decided to move his family back north, where he could feel safer and be near his family in the Netherlands. But nowhere was safe in Europe once fascist dictators controlled the willpower of their armies and much of the population. Escher and his family settled in Switzerland and Belgium for 4 years. And here, no longer surrounded by the lush landscapes of Italy, his work changed and became more cerebral. Some say he turned from landscapes to mindscapes, but there was more to it than that. The world was rapidly changing, and Escher's art was too. Here we see how Escher has taken shapes like the ones he saw in the Alhambra and turned them into geese, flying nose to wing in a pattern that could fill a wall and go on forever. If you look closely, you can see the pencil grid of Escher's guidelines in the background. And once Escher began working with repeating figures like this, his art surged forward at astonishing speed. In 1938, Escher created his woodcut, Day and Night. On the left, we see a Dutch village where people walk beside canals and watch ships sail upriver. In the center, Escher creates a sort of magic trick when the rectangular fields at the bottom of the picture start to wiggle. And then, like pulling a rabbit out of a hat, dark birds appear and fly over the village into a daytime sky. And look to the right, and the white birds fly over that same village, now in darkness. The streets are deserted, lights shine through the windows, and the ships return with their lights twinkling in the darkness. White and black birds fit together, and daytime and night occupy the same space. There's a great harmony in the way everything fits together here, but there's also the disquieting message that what once was seen by the bright light of day can suddenly, and you might say sneakily, become the black of night. In 1938, political darkness was falling on all of Europe. On May 10th, 1940, Nazi Germany invaded and occupied the Netherlands. The Nazi plans for invasion were actually discovered 6 months before German forces rolled across the Dutch border, and it must have been a terrifying wait, with some holding out hope that goodness would prevail. And even when they were occupied, things changed slowly at first, with the new commanders assuring the public that their rules were for the best and changes they made were necessary to make their country great again. Patterns do repeat themselves, don't they? The Dutch are an independently minded sort and proud of the success of their country, which had remained neutral in World War I. So while Holland was decimated by the Germans, many resisted the occupation and the Nazi regulations. Escher made the small protest woodcut you see in the background here. The poetic phrases all have double meanings, which disguise the message and let him get away with making the print. The occupation was compared to being a cabinet that was occupied, but Escher's pictures make clear that the cabinet was an outhouse and not a cabinet of government officials. At one time, the cabinet was occupied, says the poem, but one day the filth would be flushed away. And Escher dated this print December 5th, 1941. A print like this could only be circulated secretly among friends, and only 1 or 2 examples of it have been found since the war. But if you were discreet, you might not get arrested. The situation in Escher, in the Netherlands, continued to deteriorate, and soon anyone making an image like this or having a copy of it in their pocket could be shot. That's why no examples of it have been found recently. A year later, Escher was sent the German directive you see in the center. Now artists were not permitted to show or sell their work, and only art that was approved by the German Aesthetic Commission could be created. Escher wrote a note at the bottom saying he was not able to make that kind of art and therefore could not sign the form. From then on, he had to create in isolation, in secret, without an audience or an income. Cut off from society, Escher created this picture where angels and devils fit together seamlessly. In the bottom margin, he has written Christmas, 1941. Life became increasingly difficult in the Netherlands after that date. Creating artworks in seclusion, Escher intensified his creativity and used his concentration and creativity to insulate himself from the daily struggles and fear of the German occupation. In 1942, Escher began carving this sphere with angels and devils, the pattern he had drawn at Christmas the year before. It's likely that he would hide this ball when he was not working on it, in case an inspector knocked at the door. You never knew when that would happen. When Escher was working, he could forget for a while what was going on around him. He could carve and not think of the hunger his children faced, knowing finding food the next day would be uncertain. Thinking very hard about how to design this sphere, he could stop thinking about his beloved printmaking teacher, Jezrein Mesquita, who had been dragged from his home by German soldiers and murdered in Auschwitz. We know of no drawings by Escher of this carved sphere. Perhaps Escher destroyed them all, knowing their discovery would put him and his family at risk. He was creating something so complicated that the world could cease to exist while he was bringing his vision to life. He worked tirelessly, spending many months carving this globe. The angels and devils fit together equally around the equator of the sphere. Imagine you're holding the globe, and as you hold it, you turn it towards the pole. Now here, the angels grow in high relief over a flat background carved clean of devils. But turn the ball again, past the equator, where the angels and devils share the sphere, and at the other pole, the devils rise like dark cliffs above some distant flat earth. Where are the angels now? Darkness and light, angels and devils, will we see goodness or evil on our globe? During the 5 long years of war, there was no way of knowing which forces would triumph. In Europe during wartime, there was no room for neutrality. There was no place to be undecided about who should rule the country in the future. One had to be clear about which side you were on. In his work, Escher had to be certain about what would be carved away and what should be preserved. Cut off from his audience, Escher created his own reality, and here the future was uncertain, much as it is in our world today. Since the Nazi occupiers forbade Escher to show his work, he created very few prints during the war. His mind was busy and he had a lot of time on his hands, and he needed to keep his mind engaged. So the few prints he created were some of his most thoughtful and time-consuming. In 1943, Escher completed this lithograph, Reptiles, though of course he couldn't show it or sell it at that time. Here we're looking down on Escher's desktop. His notebook is open, showing a design of hexagons, which are filled in with lizards. This is one of about 130 drawings Escher made of symmetry designs in his notebook, where he created his own systems for creating these interlocking creatures. Here the shapes spring to life, and the little creatures crawl off the flat page. They climb over a book, crawl up over a draftsman's triangle to get to the top of a 12-sided dodecahedron, which is a marvelous shape. Here, the creature lets out a triumphant snort, and then his task is completed, and he flattens himself and returns to the page. Showing what can happen when 2 dimensions become 3 is especially intriguing when you remember that the drama is played out on a flat piece of paper, a lithograph, that has no 3rd dimension at all. Now, Escher did not assign meanings to his print. He simply called them his little games, and he let each viewer create their own meanings, some of which are universal and some are very personal. And in 1943, when Escher worked on this print, reality was shifting all over the world. Here we see theoretical creatures becoming very real and more than a little scary. Imagine them on your desk, or imagine they've invaded your home. That would be unwelcome for sure. It's easy for me to see parallels of the changing politics of that era and the sudden danger so many people were feeling from bombastic politicians who imposed unimaginable rules and terror on unsuspecting people. Even today, we must examine very carefully what we're seeing, just as Escher has done here. The war finally ended in 1945, but the task of rebuilding shattered nation was overwhelming. So many people were depressed and sick and still so very short of hope. In 1946, Escher made this little wood engraving with the motto in Dutch at the bottom, "We komen eruit." Like Martin Luther King's mighty phrase, "We shall overcome," the text translates as, "We shall come out of it." Wartime had been disastrous, and following victory, rebuilding after the war seemed impossible. As the Germans were forced out, they had destroyed utilities, transportation, and food supplies, leaving the Dutch with no infrastructure or means to rebuild their country. The top rung of Escher's ladder is within our grasp. And if we stretch out our arms just one more time, we can grab the top rung of the ladder and climb out of the dark well. At last, after so long, we will reach home. A beautiful tree will stand tall beside us, and birds will fly in the free sky above. In this print, Escher shows us that even if we're trapped within a darkness as complicated as this very strange eight-sided well, change is possible if we use all our strength and determination to see the light above. Culture slowly returned after the war, and Escher was able to exhibit his art again, although the world of Dutch printmakers is a small one. Here we see a poster showing 4 prints by a group of 4 artists. 3 of them we don't know much about, and their artworks might be seen as unremarkable. You can pick out Escher's red print of 4 fish in the upper left. Escher's fish fit together perfectly in a kind of circle that leaves a gap in the middle. And that space is exactly the right shape for a bird, which is easy to miss at first glance. There is always more to see in an Escher print. Once Escher was able to exhibit his art again, mathematicians became aware of his prints, and he was invited to speak at an international crystallography conference in Cambridge, England, my hometown, in 1960. One of the mathematicians there, Donald Coxeter, sent Escher this drawing, together with a journal article he had written regarding the formulas for the hyperbolic geometry on which this pattern is based. Escher could make no sense of all those numbers and symbols, but he was excited to draw out the plan for the designs he saw in the illustration. To do this, he drew lines and circles in much the same way ancient tile makers must have done, and Escher knew that to make mosaic patterns like this, you only need to be able to make straight lines and circles. You need a compass or a divider, and a straight piece of wood. Doesn't even have to have numbers on it like a ruler. Escher set to work filling the interesting spaces he created. And so about 20 years after designing the angels and devils drawing and making the angels and devils sphere during wartime, Coxeter's hyperbolic geometry enabled Escher to create a circular print filled with an endless pattern of angels and devils. Hyperbolic geometry produces patterns like this that look like they might have been painted onto a basketball. Escher found a clever way to make certain that the figures all would be identical, and in doing so, he also created the most efficient way of carving his woodblocks. Instead of carving the entire circle, Escher created a wedge that made up 1/3 of the design. So you can print that design 3 times around, and it will make a circle. Now you can fit those 3 pieces together like a perfect jigsaw puzzle. And now you can see the angels and devils have fit together, and angels surround all the devils, and devils surround all the angels. To print the gray, he needed to create a second set of wood blocks that would print the details into the angels, and that would make the final print. How many angels and devils inhabit the edges of this print? Every white space is cut away with a chisel. It's amazing. Here, Escher has made his printmaking process as complicated as the image he creates. Let's see now how Escher made a tranquil country scene into a complicated printmaking challenge. At the left, you see a polished piece of cherry wood with a hole carved near the center. If you notice the second hole, that one was drilled at the State Museum in Holland under Escher's direction to prevent anyone from reprinting his woodblocks after he died. At the right, you see the result of Escher spreading greenish ink on that flat block, rolling out the ink a little lighter at the top and darker towards the bottom. Ivory paper shows through the hole that Escher had carved in the block. Now, at the bottom left, Escher has carved a puddle-shaped hollow into a second woodblock. You can see a lot of chisel marks where Escher carved away the wood. The pattern of chisel marks actually looks a little like the bottom of a puddle, but only the top surface of the block is going to get Escher's brown ink. At the bottom right, you see the result of printing this block on top of the greenish sheet with a hole. And here, as if by magic, the hole becomes the moon and water seems to fill the puddle, and you see a sky above. Shapes have become things, and those things trigger our imagination. But Escher still has a lot to add to the image. And all the details of the print were carved into a third woodblock, a part of which you see here. What looks like smooth silver and brown is the surface of the block that Escher will ink. He's carved away a lot of the surface, and what remains will become tire tracks, footprints, and trees. Roll some black ink only on the surface, just the right amount. Too much ink will fill the tiny gaps between the lines, and then align this block precisely on top of the sheet with the hole in the puddle. Apply exactly the right amount of pressure and lift the block away. And finally, you can see Escher's woodblock puddle, completed in 1952, the year I was born. Much of what you see is an illusion. Trees are only present in their reflection. The actual trees were drawn by Escher in Italy 25 years earlier, but in this print, we believe they grow somewhere outside the edges of the print. Branches are silhouetted in front of the distant moon's reflection. We're looking down at the moon above. We're seeing reflections, signals of things beyond our sight. And we can see time as well. We know people have walked by because they left footprints. A car and a bicycle have left their own print in the soft earth. Prints within a print. What has happened here? What are we really seeing right now? We see ink on paper. Creating this woodcut meant Escher had to ink each of his 3 blocks and wait for the ink to dry before using the next block. One can only make a few prints at a time, and each one is just slightly different from all the others, but every one must be perfect. Finally, when the work was done, he signed the print in the margin and added the note at the right, Eigendruck, which means I myself printed this. And it's true, no one but Escher could have made this and printed it the way Escher did. Word spread, and Scientific American put Escher on its cover in 1961. And Escher's Horseman appeared on the cover of a book about atomic physics. His work was featured in Life magazine and Time and publications around the world. His images became part of popular culture. Musicians became early collectors of Escher's prints. The Mata Hoople album colorized reptiles at the upper left. Graham Nash and Jimmy Page bought prints from Escher. Mata Hoople colorized the reptiles. Mick Jagger wanted to use an Escher print for a Rolling Stones album, but Escher turned him down. He was too busy with his other work. You can see my favorite psychedelic Escher t-shirt at the upper right, above a shot of The Simpsons' encounter with an Escher room. Escher's designs decorated kids' puzzles, neckties, and clothing. Escher-esque became an adjective. Escher was bemused by all this fuss. He'd worked all his life in relative isolation, and he didn't consider himself part of any school or movement, and much of the art he most admired had been created centuries before. He wanted to be alone in his studio, listening to Bach's perfect music. When Escher was 70 years old, he was given his first large museum show, and his fame continued to grow. Several galleries in America started selling Escher prints for increasingly high prices. Requests for Escher's graphics piled up in Escher's small home studio in Barn, Holland. "I don't want to be a printmaking machine," Escher told one of his customers. "I want to create only as many graphics as I wish to print, and I need time to create new work." He dreamed of creating one last print. As you might expect, he made it complicated, and it's his crowning achievement. His health was deteriorating, and as he recovered from one operation after another, I believe he was more afraid of not finishing this last print than he was of dying. To make his final masterpiece, the print you saw him working on at the beginning of this presentation, Escher had to carve 3 wood blocks that you see on your left. On the right, you see a print of the top block showing just rings and snakes in black. The block in the middle fills in the snakes with some greenish ink, and the bottom block adds the accent to the rings. 3 blocks on one top of another created the wedge you see on the left. Now, you need 2 more wedges to make a circle, so Escher had to re-ink his 3 blocks to make that other wedge, and then he had to ink them once more again to make the third one. And those 3 wedges could not be separated like you see here. They had to fit together in Escher's perfect puzzle. And here is Ring Snakes, finished in July of 1969, the very month man walked on the moon. What a long journey it's been, from a small town in Holland to creating ring snakes in 1969. Here, the seemingly infinite tiny rings in the center grow and get bigger and bigger as they link together. It's as if the linking itself energizes their growth. They grow larger and larger, and when they become as big as can be, when they've reached maturity, well, that's when snakes appear. And snakes have symbolized power, good and evil, and the troubles we humans get ourselves into by thinking about things too much since the Garden of Eden. Here they writhe in and out of the rings, their life force weaving into elemental chains. Perfect atoms create imperfect creatures. Life creates chaos within order. These interlocking rings have become as big as they are able to, and so now they must become smaller and smaller again, heading towards infinity at the edges of the print. Will they grow again? And what will the snakes do? It seems to me they're escaping from the rings. But I also trust in the power of infinity. Ring snakes required 9 printings from 3 wood blocks, and Escher had only enough time left to print a few examples of this masterpiece. And here you see Escher hanging up some copies of this print to dry in his studio. He had done all he could do. He'd completed his masterpiece, but he said he could fill another lifetime making prints. Escher kept raising his prices to slow down demand, but he had created so few prints that prices quickly escalated. And Escher died in 1972, and his fame was continuing to grow a century after he began making prints. Escher had seldom charged more than a few $100s for a print, but fortunately, he was content without fame or fortune as long as he could continue to make art. In the 1960s, he apologized to a collector for having charged $200 for a print, and it was twice the going print, but this was his very last example of the print reptiles. And a couple of years ago, an example of reptiles sold for $780,000. Fortunately for collectors, Escher created a number of small woodcuts that are affordable even today, and I specialize in these smaller prints, and I enjoy their intimacy. A few years ago, a museum in Brazil achieved the greatest attendance record for any museum in the world when it exhibited Escher's work. In Brazil, the most museum goers went to see Escher than any other exhibit in the world. Every Escher book and every museum show allows new audiences to discover Escher's prints. We have yet to see what happens when AI joins with Escher in the metaverse, but that's exciting to me too. There is so much more to be learned from Escher prints as we explore our own perceptions. Escher's life, his prints, and how images help us make sense of a truly baffling world when we use our imagination and intelligence. Escher wrote, "I try in my prints to testify that we live in a beautiful and orderly world and not in a formless chaos as it sometimes appears." Escher has changed my life in extraordinary ways, and I continue to learn from his prints every day. If you have an Escher print on your wall, I guarantee you will learn from it. And I hope after this quick tour, you'll look at his prints and the world around you with an increased sense of wonder. Look carefully and prepare to be amazed. And that's the end of this amazing journey. Thank you for being here, and special thanks to Adrian Van Alpen and Maggie Maloney at the Netherlands-American Foundation. And I think we might have some questions from the audience.
Yes, Jeffrey, there are 8 questions in the Q&A section. If you click it, then you can see those 8 questions, and maybe you can check them out and start from the top.
Sure. Well, they asked what pictures were in my MIT program, and it was similar to this one, but the couple of months in between has let me improve it and add some more images, but basically it was very similar to this talk with the same images. Craig Lambert asks, where is the globe with angels and devils now? Well, after Escher's death, his three sons took charge of what they called the Escher Foundation. And Escher had to put his work into a foundation to avoid taxes. His work had become valuable, and the taxing structure in the Netherlands made it easier for them to be a separate foundation. And they placed this work in trust at what was called then the Fragmented Museum and is now the Kunstmuseum in The Hague. And it stayed there for 10 years. And then the sons had to decide what they would do next. And they got a rather generous offer to sell part of the collection. And that's what they did. Now, this split up what was the complete collection of Escher's work at the end of his life, but it did enable people like me to collect works from his studio and some museum collections, like one was shown in Houston a couple of years ago, to see the processes that Escher used and prints that might otherwise never be seen. Someone asked, can you recommend how to determine the value of an original Escher print and the best places to buy or sell his work? Well, the ownership of the Escher Foundation changed last year, and that freed up a lot of constraints that were on museum exhibits and publishing. Now that the foundation is in what I consider better hands, there are many exciting plans for museum exhibits and new books coming up in the future. The best books to look at are, I consider, Escher's M.C. Escher's Life in Complete Graphic Work. That shows you all of his 450 prints. And The Magic of M.C. Escher is a book that is really beautiful with great illustrations. Even the inside of the cover has a copy of Escher's big Metamorphosis. So those are the two best books. There are about 10 others. If anybody's interested, let me know. Kathleen G asks, what's the Job in the print with the lizards coming out of the page? Well, actually, it's a packet of cigarette papers. The brand name was Job. It doesn't have anything to do with the Book of Job. As Escher said, he doesn't put meanings into his prints usually. And people in the Netherlands to this day love to roll their own cigarettes. Gary Arlen, my friend, asks, how did you get involved with Escher? Well, my dad was a scientist. Derek de Sala Price was a professor of history of science at Yale, and his scientific colleagues put up Escher posters in their laboratories and bought original prints from Escher himself back at a time when you could do that. My dad put me in touch with some of those people. I bought some of their prints because they had increased at that time in the late 70s, early 80s. They were 10 times what people had paid for them. Struggling academics like to have a little breathing room in their expenses. And I started to sell Escher prints. Then I was lucky enough to get in touch with the folks, the person who had bought part of the Escher Foundation. And he was incredibly generous with me and lived 15 minutes away from my gallery, Artists Market in Norwalk, Connecticut. So he would lay out prints on his breakfast table that I'd never seen before. It was before M.C. Escher's Life and Work was published. And through his generosity, I was able to really make a life of selling Escher prints and take my gallery from being a small arts and crafts gallery to being a very big gallery that I successfully closed 3 years ago, and it's rare for an arts and crafts gallery to exist for 50 years and end successfully. William Insinger asks, where is Escher's grave located? It is in Barn, Holland, where Escher lived. And if you search for it, you'll find that cemetery there. Arve Tokheim says, what do you think he would have felt about the mass consumerism, mass production of knockoffs that occurred after his death? That's a really interesting question. I think I used the word bemused before. He did allow for one of his spheres to be recreated in a limited edition. I think if it was done respectfully and interestingly, I think he would have enjoyed it. Where's the largest collection of Escher's works located? Well, it's in private hands, and eventually my hope is that we'll go to a museum, and we don't know where that museum will be located or what will happen to the largest collection, but there are big collections of Escher's work at the National Gallery in Washington. They have plans for another exhibit in a few years. The Kunstmuseum in The Hague has a wonderful collection. Generally, at museums, you have to make appointments to see prints unless they're having a special exhibit. One of the fellows that I sold a lot of prints to made a private museum that specialized in Escher's work in Athens, Greece, and now his Escher collection tours America. It's been in Florida, in Naples, and in even Cooperstown, New York. So watch museum schedules and watch Facebook. My Facebook group, The Escherian, tries to post news of Escher exhibits. Thank you, Jim. Esther Williams says that Escher knew his main interest from childhood. How was he so precise mathematically? Well, his dad was an engineer, and he would draw out plans for things like the waterworks in Holland, how to keep the sea back from the land. So Escher learned those skills and had the tools. So I would imagine when Dad was working, he would hand Escher some paper, maybe an illustration of something he'd seen when Escher's dad was working in Japan. And somehow Escher got the precise mind that usually guides mathematicians, but he had this precise mind and was definitely a right-brained creative thinker. But that crossover between creative thinking and analytical thinking is much more complicated than anyone knows about. And Escher was a creative thinker with a precise mathematical mindset. Mark Haas asks, how was Escher able to precisely register the wood blocks? And yes, they appear seamlessly. Registering those 9 wood blocks for ring snakes is really crazy complicated. And each of the wood blocks aligns in a little bit different way. But in Escher's multiple wood blocks, there are always little cheats. There might be a notch cut out at the side of a wood block, or someplace where you're putting the second wood block down on top of the first printed one, you can see where it has to go. That's one of the cheats that you learn if you're doing wood blocks in multiple colors. I think that answers all the questions.
Jeffrey, I actually have one final one, and that is, how do we purchase your book?
Thank you for asking that. When the ownership of the foundation changed, I was given permission to print 100 copies of my book, Amazing Images. And I wanted it to go to museums and to collectors because it shows a side of Escher that you don't normally see. It gives really an illustrated tour of my life as a collector. The prints that I've hung at Artist Market and collected, I photographed each print myself. I wrote all the text, and you can get it by getting in touch with me, Jeff, at artistsmarket.com. That's Jeff at artists, like a whole bunch of artists, ARTISTS, and those artists go to market. So it's artistsmarket.com. That was the name of my gallery. And if you write to me, I charge $100 for the book, which is just about what it cost me to print it. And I do have a few copies left.
All right.
There is one more question.
Well, are there more questions? All right.
There's one more. Let me answer it quickly. Yes. What would Escher typically do with his misprints and trial prints? There are very few misprints in Escher. He tore them up and threw them away. There are proof prints, and those proof prints are in the museum collections and the large private collection that was formed out of the foundation collection. So you can see some of them in the books, but you really have to go to one of the major exhibits to see them. And that's about it. All Escher prints tend to be pretty darn perfect, and that was how Escher wanted them.
Excellent. I think that was the last question, Jeffrey.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you very much for this wonderful webinar and this really in-depth explanation of Escher's work. I hope the audience also was impressed and liked it, and will continue to be amazed by Escher's artwork. I, for one, really enjoyed it, and thanks for doing this. And I hope again that the audience appreciated it. From the questions, I would say yes, and it was actually an amazing audience. We had like maybe 85 participants, so that's pretty good.
That's great. And if anybody is interested in talking to me about acquiring Escher prints, particularly his smaller graphics, which of course tend to be more affordable, again, Jeff at artistsmarket.com. Thank you all very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and goodbye, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you. You too. Bye.